Hey guys, and welcome to part two of my tier list ranking of the US presidents. This is my second attempt at recording this, so I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker this time. But I'm going to try to get straight into it. I'm not going to try to waste any time. Just a quick notice I made a few changes from the last one. Moved Grant down a tier to the top of B tier and James Monroe down to the top of C tier, largely having to do with, again, treatment of Native Americans, which I think reflecting on their presidencies generally looked down upon, brings them down a tier, at least for me. And just a quick reminder, I'm going to be doing this based off of their effectiveness as president, trying to put aside their character, because again, if I was ranking these guys on character, a lot of them would probably be down here. so, so with that aside, let's get right back into it. Starting off with William McKinley, who is kind of Trump's idol, starting with his second term. And I think this is largely because of how he managed to get us the Philippines. He got us a foothold in Cuba after he got us into a war with Spain. Um, Now, obviously, this war wasn't something that came without atrocities. There were plenty of atrocities committed during this war, largely against the Spanish, largely against Filipinos, because America instigated the war. I think it's pretty obvious that that happens. I think McKinley's kind of in a similar situation to Polk, where saw the country gain a huge amount of territory. Well, not a huge amount of territory, but the influence of the country largely grew. Um, and that as a whole mostly benefits the country. I'm gonna put him probably above James K. Polk here in the B tier. Moving on to Teddy Roosevelt. So I'm just gonna say it. I think Teddy Roosevelt's probably an S tier president. What to say about him? The Food and Drug Administration trying to ensure that food, medicine, drugs, all these things are properly handled by the government, that Americans stay healthier. Um, his fondness for nature, establishment of natural parks, his kind of humble but deadly attitude that he wanted to establish for the United States, his whole kind of carry a big stick motto, began the process of creating the Panama Canal. I think Teddy Roosevelt's largely looked upon as one of our better presidents. I'm going to keep him here in S tier. Followed by Taft, who I think, in at least in my opinion, is probably just a kind of dumbed down or lesser version of Roosevelt, because they largely hold similar policies, similar political views. He's our fattest president, but he did not get stuck in the bathtub. There's no evidence to support that. It is a myth. A lot of trust busting under his administration, um, corporate and business influence in the government, although that's always been present within the United States. If I just go off the saying that he is a dumbed down version of Roosevelt, I mean, yeah, probably bottom of B tier. I think that's fine. Followed by Woodrow Wilson. Okay, so if I were incorporating character, this man would essentially be the devil. Woodrow Wilson was a hardcore racist, pro eugenics, um, did not care what people thought about him, very much into press censorship all around. He kind of reinstates the Alien and Sedition Acts that John Adams proposed. Um, but again, we're not talking about character. We're talking about their presidency. That's still going to keep him, I think, at the top of F tier here. Um, Number one, he screens The Birth of a Nation at the White House, which is seen as a very racist, propagandic film for the KKK. So he's very just not really hiding his racism. Makes it extremely difficult for blacks to get jobs during his administration. If you aren't white, you're not getting a job. And I'm not sure why he's been so popular for so long. I think his ideas in his 14 points are largely looked upon as great. And while, yes, I think they were, he largely failed to implement them. His points were largely disregarded in the Treaty of Versailles. His efforts to maintain peace largely did not work because we went straight into World War II. He failed to get the United States into his own creation, that being the League of Nations. Mostly a failure at what he did, and very racist at the same time. All of that incorporated into his presidency. I think Woodrow Wilson's an F tier president. I just do. Warren G. Harding is seen as one of our most corrupt presidents. So at the time, he was largely popular, but with the benefit of hindsight, we now know that he pretty much let a lot of his wealthy, influential, and corrupt buddies kind of run the government. He dies a couple years into his presidency from a heart attack. Nowhere near as bad as these guys, and I probably put him at the top of D tier just if it's based on just corruption. Followed by Calvin Coolidge, who I think is a president that every single president should aspire to be, at least in terms of demeanor, attitude, general treatment of the position of president. Calvin Coolidge has kind of gotten this reputation of how he largely handled the presidency as a job, not a position of power. He did not want to abuse it. He was very much a quiet and reserved man. I think there's a lot of good things to say about Coolidge. The only thing I would point out that is very about him is his pretty noticeable ignorance of science when it came to the matters of lead being incorporated into some of our products. But still, having said that, I mean, Calvin Coolidge is looked upon as one of our greatest presidents. I don't think he's S tier, but since A tier has been empty now, I'm going to put him in A tier, though that might change. Herbert Hoover. Pretty decent guy, but a very terrible president. So, does absolutely nothing to stop the stock market crash of 1929, started the Great Depression, and he leads the country terribly through the Great Depression. That is what has ruined his reputation. That is what he is known for. Herbert Hoover is going to be in the F tier for me. Probably, he's definitely not worse than Johnson, not worse than these guys. Oh man, this is tough. I think Woodrow Wilson is worse. Well, worst president. Character-wise, Woodrow Wilson is worse, but I think he's ever so slightly a better president. FDR, Frank Delano Roosevelt. This is a tough one. It's either A or S tier for me. I'm going to do S tier for now. Obviously, the big thing here, he leads the country through World War II. A significant chunk of his New Deal policies to lead the nation through the Great Depression are largely successful. All of that, I think, would put him in the S tier, one of our greatest presidents. I think the thing that definitely brings him down a bit is obviously the Japanese internment camps on the West Coast. Basically, if you were of Japanese ethnicity, descent, you were put into these concentration camps. While obviously nowhere near as bad as the ones in Nazi Germany, still a pretty inhumane and terrible thing to do, despite it being a period of wartime. Still, having said that, I think, again, at least as of now, FDR is generally looked upon very favorably by a lot of Americans. I'm going to put him, I think I'll probably put him below Teddy Roosevelt. Then we have Harry Truman, who I think's probably, I think Truman's probably an A tier. So there's obviously the drama of him dropping the atomic bombs on Japan, and as much as that is a devastating loss, unfortunately, I do think that was probably the right move. with the lack of information that the U.S. had and the very clear implications that Japan was not willing to surrender yet at the very moment, and the pretty immediate fact that an invasion of mainland Japan would lead to millions and millions of lives cost. Unfortunately, I do think the dropping of the bombs was probably more than necessary, as much as it pains me to say that. But moving on from that, I think largely his kind of attempts to contain the Soviet Union and communism during the Cold War, mostly successful. His attempts to help the Eastern Bloc countries or the suffering European countries with economic aid, I think, was mostly successful. Um, I think Truman's probably an A tier for me, followed by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who I think is also an A tier president. A lot to say about this guy. I think his speech on the military industrial complex is one of the most famous speeches in our history. Um, his stance on infrastructure, getting all of that set up, I think is something that cannot be forgotten. His stance on civil rights, enforcing desegregation as that starts to become a thing, kind of ensuring that black children are established well into these schools. He could have done a lot better with civil rights, but I think overall Dwight D. Eisenhower is probably an A tier president. Obviously served in World War II. So John F. Kennedy. I think Kennedy is largely overrated, mostly in terms of his character. Again, I won't be incorporating that into here, but him just being a general womanizer, very clearly cheated on his wife with another woman. Um, Man loved ladies. Very overrated in that sense, and I think he gets a boost in popularity simply because of the unfortunate fact that he was assassinated at such a young age. Um, but I do think his leadership skills during the Cold War were very good. Obviously, he could have handled the Cuban Missile Crisis a lot better. I think that was the closest the world came to ending was during that handling. But he managed to lead us through it. His stance on civil rights, I think he's probably, yeah, I'm going to keep JFK in the A tier here. Lyndon B. Johnson. So, Lyndon B. Johnson's a tough one. There are some good things and some bad things about him. So, he passes the Civil Rights Act, which JFK started putting forward before he was killed. He gets that passed. Great, wonderful. Um, and then he just makes everything so much worse, at least in terms of the Vietnam War, war crimes and atrocities committed on the Vietnamese people, pretty much by him, and especially like Agent Orange, napalm, dropped on Vietnam. Um, and then sending more and more troops to Vietnam as it's very clearly a losing battle, at least at that very moment for the Americans. Um, he's a very controversial figure, Johnson, and while I don't think he's bad, right, at least in the sense of bad as these guys here, um, I think Johnson's probably top of C tier. The good and the bad kind of balance, in my opinion. And interestingly enough, kind of a similar position on Nixon here. So obviously, the big thing on Nixon is the Watergate scandal, him pretty much trying to get dirt on his Democratic rivals by having people break into Watergate, right? Um, and that has definitely tarnished his reputation. Obviously, not a good thing, but I do not think it should be ignored. His general handling of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, I think is something that can mostly be praised. Also, he improved relations between us, the United States, and China, which I think is a very good thing. Um, I'm probably going to put Nixon right next to Johnson. In fact, probably the tiniest bit better than Johnson. Um, But these both are kind of in a similar boat. They have a lot of good things and a lot of bad things that balance them out. If Nixon won an election earlier, like say when he ran against Kennedy, maybe he'd be higher up. But just, I don't know. I'm going to keep him right next to Johnson here. Gerald Ford, who is one of our only presidents to not be elected. By this, he's elected after Nixon resigns, and he steps into office to take his place and just does not win the next election. I'll be quick with this guy, top of D tier. I mean, the fact that he pardoned Nixon as soon as he took office pretty much just ensured that this man would have no future in the presidential office should he seek re-election. I think it's pretty obvious there. Jimmy Carter recently passed away, rest in peace. This man is one of our greatest presidents in terms of character. Beautiful soul. Always did his best to look out for others. Unfortunately, that did not translate well into his presidency. It's looked upon not the best. Obviously, we go through an economic crisis, the Iranian hostage situation as well. Um, his presidency is very subpar, unfortunately, and it hurts me to say that because I like Jimmy Carter, but yeah, just unfortunately not the best presidency, but a wonderful man. Rest in peace. Ronald Reagan. So this might be a very controversial take. I do not get the hype around Reagan. This could just be because I have a political bias, but I will say this. I think his stance on the Soviet Union, his kind of no tolerance for BS, I do largely like. He saw us pretty much through the end of the Cold War, though not quite. That's mostly Bush Sr. that does that. Um, I think that's to be commended. However, his policy of trickle down economics, his tax cuts for the rich, obviously those economic issues are still felt today, right? You can say what you want about trickle down economics. I think it's a terrible idea. Um, his It's not entirely his fault, but the mistreatment of blacks in the welfare system under his administration, the war on drugs, a lot of, I think, just terrible, poorly executed ideas. And I honestly do not get the hype for Reagan. I think Dwight D. Eisenhower is a much better Republican figurehead than Ronald Reagan. I honestly do. I think he's a very charismatic guy, but I'm going to be honest, I think he's probably between Nixon and Johnson. To be complete, well, oh man, I'll put him at the top of C tier. And this is still a pretty controversial take because a lot of people I see who rank presidents put Ronald Reagan in B, A, hell, maybe even S tier. I do not get it. I do not get it. I do not really like a lot of his policies. For me, he's going to be a C tier. I know that there are some good things about his presidency. So he's going to be in the same boat like these two, but I do not think he is as good as other people are saying. Um, George Bush, or George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., much better than his son. Um, I think the main thing for me in terms of good things is his kind of improvements for the disabled within the country, making it easier for them in this country, benefits wise. Obviously, he gets us into the Gulf War, which is largely looked down upon. Um, Kind of a similar situation. I'm probably going to put, oh, yeah, you know what? There we go. I will say about Bush Sr., the his famous quote of "Read my lips, no new taxes," to then immediately implement new taxes is very funny. But he's probably going to be C tier here as well. Bill Clinton, putting aside his character and his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, he did not have sexual relations with that woman, right? Putting that aside, I think Bill Clinton was a very good president. And that largely just, I think, does fall upon the time he was elected, right? We see the Cold War pretty much coming to an end, although that's mostly under Bush Sr. here. Russia is now kind of reformed, and for a brief period of time, there is largely world peace. Obviously, not fully, there's still some conflict. But at least for America, there is a pretty decent chunk of peace. I think people refer to it as a Pax Americana, which I think they're trying too hard with that, but whatever. Um, Very, very great in terms of our economy booming during his presidency. Um, and yeah, again, I think it largely falls onto just the period he was elected in. I think it definitely does him a lot of favors. I'm going to put Bill Clinton probably B tier, top of B tier. I'm going to be honest. Bush Jr., George W. Bush, top of D tier. So I think his handling and his kind of unifying of the American population post 9/11, wonderful, great. I think he did a good job at that. However, his handling of the actual conflict in the Middle East, the kind of lie proposed by him in Congress, although it's mostly misinformation of weapons of mass destruction, his handling of the Hurricane Katrina, just nah. And then he's a people give it to Obama, but he's largely responsible for our economic recession that starts in the mid 2000s. George W. Bush, top of D tier. And here are the big three boys right here. So Barack Obama. So I think the best thing about Obama was definitely Obamacare. Saved a lot of lives. I think it's really questionable if someone were to kind of disagree with the fundamentals behind what Obamacare really is. I think that there are a lot of good things to say about Obama. There's also some bad things to say about Obama. Um, his handling of, again, the wars in the Middle East, a lot of drone strikes under his administration that killed thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of innocent civilians. Um, Obviously, there's that hospital that gets blown up with innocent people and children in there. That's obviously not really something I can defend him for. I think Obama probably top of C tier. Donald Trump. We're going to be doing his first term because we're only just into his second term, but I do have a few things to say. Donald Trump. So here's something I did like about his first term. The First Step Act, which is very unlike Trump, pretty much proposing criminal reform. That's crazy. That is so unlike Donald J. Trump. However, I think the most immediate thing I can think of, and a lot of people can think of, is as president, openly inciting a coup d'etat, an attempted coup d'etat, an insurrection on January 6th, 2021, trying to overthrow the democratic process because he claimed the election was stolen, could not handle that he lost. His cozying up to some world leaders and dictators is kind of it's kind of a gray situation because kind of similar to Nixon, he did better our relationship with China and North Korea. But again, he's a lot more buddy buddy than just coming to an agreement with them. I think he looks up to these individuals a lot more than he should be. Um, you cannot, at least in my opinion, you cannot be president of the free world and then praise Xi Jinping and Kim Jong Un, known men who have committed crimes and atrocities, are leaders of pretty terrible countries to live in, at least when it comes to the sense of free speech, more so in North Korea than China. His blatant mishandling of the COVID pandemic, which cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans, blatant disregard for science and basic medical health. D tier. Some of you guys might be mad, but that's just a simple fact. At least for me, my opinion, Trump is not a good president. Reason he's not an F tier is because there are a couple of good things that I do like, but the common sense is just not present. The no, no, no. And during the last year of his presidency, obviously because of that mishandling of the COVID pandemic, the economy starts to go to shite. And he gets a lot of credit for the economic boom, which was largely instigated by Obama. He takes the credit for that, not what happened whatsoever. Joe Biden. So I will be the first to admit that this man was way too old to be president, but in fairness, so was Trump. It's very obvious that there are some mental issues going on up inside Joe's head. Um, Probably, if I had to guess, some early stages of dementia. Who knows? Still, having said that, and this is quite a feat, just given his mental state, the Biden administration has done more good than it has done harm. This is something I've said before. And just to kind of condense this down pretty quickly, I'll largely be looking at this from an economic viewpoint. Trump's mishandling of the COVID pandemic, the economy goes to shite. Biden is then forced to recover the economy over the next year or so, which he largely does a good job at. And people do not want to fact check this, but he does largely, he has actually done a fairly decent job in recovering the economy. I think the United States was the most prosperous nation in that aspect, at least among the G20 nations. Um, just for a direct comparison, gas prices in my home state went from like 420 near the start of his administration down to like 219, and now they've started to rise back up again. As obviously because we're imposing tariffs on our own allies. What? Um, but as I've said before, I think Biden is probably going to unfortunately be looked upon a lot like Jimmy Carter. But I'm going to be saying this. I think Joe Biden's a C tier president. I'm probably going to put him right behind Obama. So, yeah, that's my stance on those two. Tried to be quick with them just because these are recent additions to this tier list. So, but yeah, so there you have it. There is my presidential tier list fully completed. I'm sure that there's going to be some disagreement, mainly from how I've placed the last 3 or 4 or 5 presidents. And that's fine. That's fine. As long as we can be respectful about it, I'm totally cool with that. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this. This is the list has changed as I've put some thought into it, but it's been a pretty fun process, at least for me. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video.